Hi, this is Pete Thompson. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what you do when things don't go the way you want them to go. Some of the things we're going to talk about today are the what's called the Preparedness, Prevention, and Contingency Plan, or the PPC plan, the Emergency Action Plan, the Fire Prevention Plan, and then a little bit about fire extinguishers. The PPC plan, which we can call it that because it's a lot easier, is a plan that's required by the state of Pennsylvania. And it's basically addresses what happens if you have a spill or a leak of some sort of chemical or material. There's there's a number of sections. Obviously, there's a section A and B, but the sections that are more pertinent are section C, which is a spill and leak response, section D, countermeasures, and section E, the emergency spill control network. And what we'll see is that the PPC plan and the emergency action plan are somewhat similar. This PPC plan is more aimed at spills of material. The emergency action plan is more aimed at other emergencies like injuries or fires or things like that. In section C, so the PPC plan, that PPC plan is available. The plan manager will have a copy of that. Hopefully there's one available somewhere so you can see it. These are the sections in the PPC plan, section C. And you'll see that there's some sections that revolve around preparing, like to make sure that bad things don't happen. There's a section on pre-release planning. There's a section on material compatibility. That's basically to make sure that your containers are the proper containers to store materials in so that they don't leak. There's an inspection and monitoring program that's just to make sure that everything's watched properly. Preventive maintenance program, again, to make sure equipment is taken care of. Housekeeping program, which hopefully you're all familiar with housekeeping there. Security, as far as keeping the people that you don't want in there out of there. External factors, that's things like weather emergencies or other issues that may come up. And then finally, employee training. Section D is called countermeasures. And it's basically a countermeasure is something you do to make sure to address if there's some sort of emergency. So you'll see that there's countermeasures undertaken by facility. That's basically what we would do to clean up some sort of spill or emergency. Countermeasures undertaken by contractors. If there's a big spill or big emergency, obviously we would have a contractor come in and help take care of that, so we didn't have to take care of it ourselves. Internal and external communications. In this and the emergency action plan, there's lists of telephone numbers, starting with 911 and going to other places like the spill contractors and other responders that you may need. Section 4 is evacuation plan, which is also an emergency action plan. And then the section 5 or part 5 of section D has the equipment available, which we may have for response. And then the PPC plan, section E, is just what arrangements we have with emergency response agencies in case there's an emergency, and then a list of different agencies that need to be notified. Depending on what spills and how big the spill is and where the spill is, there are a lot of different places that may need to be notified, anywhere from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection or the DEP, local agencies, the EPA, Homeland Security, a whole bunch of different agencies. Second, we're going to talk about the emergency action plan, and that hopefully is more familiar to you. It has basically what you do in case of emergency, and this is more employee oriented. So you'll see that in the emergency action plan there are escape procedures and routes. That tells you where to go and what to do if there's some sort of emergency. It also should, the emergency action plan for each specific facility will have a list or a location as to where you go in case of emergency. So for example, if there were a tornado at the facility, it would say that you would go to some certain tornado safe place. If there was a fire or an injury, everybody would meet in one place just to make sure everybody was accounted for. The second bullet, procedures for remaining to operate critical equipment. It doesn't really apply here, but there are cases like, for example, a nuclear power plant where people would need to stay in place to operate important equipment. Procedure to account for employees, like I said, there would be a meeting place. Hopefully you're familiar with where that meeting place is. If you're not, ask your fellow employees or your plant manager. And then we would have to make sure we account for everybody. So for example, if there's a fire, we want to make sure everybody is accounted for. Rescue and medical duties are outlined in the emergency action plan as far as what kind of rescue anybody would do or medical duties would do. Means to report emergencies, alarm systems generally. If it's a situation where you think you may need to call 911, either for a police department to come, the fire department to come, or some sort of medical response, that's what you do to do that. And then there are some specifics on emergency types in the emergency action plan. Medical emergencies, probably the most likely case of emergency on the facility. If you're in close proximity, you may see a medical emergency, be it hopefully you don't hear the cat in the background. He's hungry again, but he needs to lose weight. If you are in close proximity to what happens in an emergency, then you would be expected to at least notify other people. There are some employees who have CPR and first aid training, and then they may be available to address the injury with first aid or with CPR. Again, that's more major industries. The most important thing for any injury, if you're not sure what's going on, or if it's an injury that you're pretty sure won't be able to be addressed, call the magic number 911 and call them to tell them where to come to. And then also, as far as dispatch information, at a plant, if it's a large facility, which typically we have, you would want to have somebody to be there to point the 911 responders in the right direction so that they know where to go in case of emergency. Fires, explosions. We're going to talk a little bit about fires in a minute. Characteristics of a fire, obviously, no fire is a good fire if it's not under control. Proper fire extinguisher we'll talk about a little bit. And we talked about means of egress and mustering points. That's just the place where you meet. If there is severe weather, like I talked about, a thunderstorm, tornadoes, things like that, that would be something. I think most people now, the cell phones give you like a warning if there's some sort of tornado or bad weather event, and then there would be a warning about that. And if we do need to get out of the buildings and find a safe place to meet them, we would do that. And again, that's something that is, again, facility specific. And if you don't know where those places are, then you should ask your plant manager. Some other emergencies that may come up, if there are any sort of terrorism, bomb threats, or like problems like that, which was a big concern in the past, that's addressed in the emergency action plan. Also things like power failures, as far as what you would do in case of an emergency, in case of a power failure. Other emergency issues, if you do have an emergency, unless you're told otherwise, like to evacuate or to go to either a meeting point or to like a tornado shelter, you should generally just remain where you are. Emergency phone numbers, again, it's 911 is the number to call. Any of the more detailed requirements with, like I said, the environmental agencies, that would be handled by the plant manager. And then finally, media relations. If there is a bad accident or something happens, often the TV channels will show up, and just don't talk to them. Tell them you're not authorized to discuss anything with them, and forward any kind of concerns to upper management. Fire extinguishers. Hopefully you're all familiar with the fire triangle. Basically, in order to have a fire, you need three things. You need oxygen, you need heat, and you need fuel. So we used to talk about carburetors in cars, about having the fuel, having the heat, having oxygen, but there aren't really carburetors in cars anymore, so I can't talk about those. Obviously, for any fire, you need to have the oxygen. The oxygen promotes the fire. The fuel, which would be like the gasoline or wood or something that catches on fire, and then heat in order to catch it. So like, for example, a spark. If you don't have, the trick about any kind of fire is if you eliminate one of these legs of the triangle, then you don't have a triangle and you won't have a fire. So if you can eliminate the oxygen, for example, by smothering a fire, then the fire will go out. If you take the fuel away from the fire, say you have like a natural gas line that bursts and is on fire, if you turn off the gas, you're going to keep the fire from continuing. And likewise, if you don't have the heat. So for example, if you have a combination of like fuel that's spilled and you have obviously oxygen in the air, if you don't have a heat or a spark there, then you're not going to have fire. So just that's the trick as far as keeping the fire from burning. This is not particularly important, but just so you're aware of it, there are 4 different classes of fires. And you'll see that on a fire extinguisher, and they usually have very good markings as far as what kind of fire they can address. Class A is basically normal combustibles, things like wood, paper, cloth. Type B is flammable liquids, things like gasoline, oil, and grease. And type C is an electrical fire, like an energized electrical equipment. Type D, we don't really deal with that much, but it would be like metals, like potassium, sodium, and those have a very special fire problems. The trick with these is that there are different types of extinguishers for these. So for example, if you have obviously a Class A fire, a wood fire, you can put water on it, it will put it out. If you have a Class B fire that has, say, a gasoline fire, if you put water on that, basically, as you know, like the gasoline and the water don't mix, and you're just going to spread the fire. Likewise, if you put water onto an electrical fire, that can cause a lot of problems. So there's a little bit more about that. So water for Class A fires, but not for Class B or C. Carbon dioxide is often carbon dioxide or dry chemical are the 2 main fire extinguishers that you'll see hanging on the wall. And probably more so dry chemical, but carbon dioxide is just a gas that's compressed into a cylinder, and you can put it on the fire, and it will put out a Class B, a liquid fire or an electrical fire. It will put out like a wood fire, but there's a chance that it will light back up again, because once the carbon dioxide, which is just a gas, would go away, then the fire could reignite. Dry chemical is a material called ammonium phosphate. It's just a powder, and it's pressurized in the cylinder by nitrogen, and that will sit on top of the fire and take out the oxygen and keep the fire from burning. It's like a blanket putting on the fire. So there's 4 different steps that you do to put out a fire. And the way to remember that is what's called the pass technique. And the pass is the 4 letters that you use. So you can see that P is pull the pin. A is aim at the base of the fire, although that picture is not a very good picture because he's not aiming at the base of the fire. S is squeeze the top of the handle or the lever to make the material come out, and then sweep from side to side at the base of the fire. So those are the 4 steps: P-A-S-S, pass. The other thing about a fire extinguisher is that generally, if there's a fire and you can get a fire extinguisher and you feel like you can do it safely, then you can then you're welcome to try to put the fire out. Nothing's more important than an employee getting hurt, not hurt. So if you feel like the fire's too big, if you feel like you aren't comfortable using the fire extinguisher, then you should not try to put the fire out. There are fires that are just too big for an extinguisher, and they should just be left and call the fire department. Also, if you need to use more than 1 fire extinguisher, generally you should walk away and just let the fire department deal with it. They obviously have a lot more equipment to take care of things like that. And then one more quick thing, we have also what's called a fire prevention plan. And basically that assigns responsibility to make sure the fire hazards are taken care of. And it's mostly about taking care of materials, keeping equipment maintained, keeping good housekeeping so that we don't have a fire. And that has basically a list of who does what to make sure that the fires don't come around, if you will. The other thing that's in there in the fire prevention plan is just a little bit about the different types of fire hazards, like electrical hazards, portable heaters, and how we control the fires from those. So that just has sort of general guidelines on how you make sure you don't have a fire. So that's about it for what happens when bad things happen. If you have any questions, please let me know, or ask your supervisor or your plant manager. Thanks a lot.